from our reviser of the legislation. So again, Senate Bill 184. Committee, you should have a folder in front of you and come up with a lot of questions for our revisers. Oh, I'm sorry. Reviser Lawrence, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. As the chair said, Senate Bill 184 would amend the Kansas Dry Cleaner Environmental Response Act. The act is administered by the KDHE Bureau of Environmental Remediation and provides for the registration, pollution prevention, and remediation for releases. With regard to funding, current law provides the Dry Cleaning Facility Release Trust Fund, and that fund receives money from registration fees, solvent fees, an environmental surcharge for dry cleaning services, and a deductible for corrective action costs. Senate Bill 184 would increase the environmental surcharge from 2.5% to 5% and increase the corrective action cost deductible from $5,000 to $10,000. Additionally, the bill would address violations of the act. Specifically, not registering with the department or paying a registration fee would be an unlawful act and subject to enforcement and penalties. Senate Bill 184 would also provide that failing to remit certain fees or taxes collected under the act would be a violation, and the Secretary of KDHE or the Director of the Bureau may impose a penalty of up to $10,000 per violation, and in the case of a continuing violation, every month that such violation continues would be deemed a separate violation. The bill also updates definitions for relevant terms used throughout the act and makes some technical changes. The bill would take effect on July 1 upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Committee questions of our reviser. Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this previous legislation that's been looked at? Did the House look at this last year, 2 years ago?
And I do know off the top of my head, in 2020, there was a similar bill that ran into 2020, so it did not make it all the way through the process. That's the one I can remember off the top of my head, but the department may have additional ones they are aware of.
Okay. You don't see a lot of bills about dry cleaners, so it's one of those, I'm trying to figure out if this is familiar language or not. Thank you.
And I think, Senator Blue, that we will get an answer to your question when the department testifies, but yes, it is not brand new. Additional questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you. Our first conferee this morning is Kate Gleason, Deputy Director of KDHE. And so, Deputy Director Gleason, welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Chairman Peck, committee. My name is Kate Gleason. I'm the Deputy Director of Environment at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and I'm here to speak in favor as a proponent of this bill. The Dry Cleaning Environmental Response Act was promulgated in 1995 as a joint effort with the dry cleaning industry. The outdated housekeeping practices from many decades ago led to a significant number of dry cleaning contaminated sites. These dry cleaners use solvents that get into the soil and travel through groundwater in very long, thin plumes. They're highly migratory. And so we worked with them in '95 to pass this act into law. Over the past, and you'll see on the second page of my testimony, the blue line that shows the decreasing revenue income became an issue in the late first decade of the 2000s. So about 15 years ago, we started to identify that the revenue stream was not keeping pace with what we were anticipating and wasn't allowing us to address sites as aggressively as we would like to. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm popping this mic too much. So we...
Or the mic, or talk over it, or
Okay.
talk under it, one or the other. The mics are pretty hot, they'll pick you up.
Okay, and other rooms are not as as hot as this, so I'm used to leaning in too much. Okay, so the agency worked up this bill as a stopgap for that funding. And as the revisor's office stated, we have 4 streams of income for the trust fund. The environmental surcharge is a 25-cent on every $10 tax that consumers pay. We are proposing to increase that to 50 cents per $10. The second is that we're proposing to increase is the deductible. So when folks identify a site, they're the property owner of a former dry cleaner or an active dry cleaner, they want to get into this trust fund, they pay a deductible currently of $5,000. We are proposing to increase that to $10,000, which is a great deal for the industry and folks, because it buys you $5 million of liability protection here, because we will then take the cost of cleanup up to $5 million. The other two streams of income we're not proposing to increase, although there are some language cleanup changes around them. One is the solvent fee that's paid by solvent distributors, and the other is the facility registration fee of $100 a year. The other changes that we have in here are related to collection of those fees. Not to, disparage a sister agency, but to the Department of Revenue, this amount of money is very small potatoes. And so we worked with them on this language to get the revenue reported to us so that we could take enforcement action against folks who are not complying with this, just to keep the playing field level for everyone, right? Every dry cleaner should be paying the same fees. And we think we could handle that in-house and take that off revenue's plate. This was discussed, this bill, to answer your question, Senator Blue, a very similar bill to this was proposed in 2020. It went through the House side, and then the shutdown happened, and so it died in 2020. There are a few changes from that bill in 2020, just as we looked at the language again, but we thought that this was a good year to bring this back and look at it, because after 2020, you'll see on the revenue chart, obviously no one was dry cleaning their clothes because no one was leaving the house. So there were some really anomalous years as far as what dry cleaners were going through. So we held off for a few years, and we thought, based on the numbers we're seeing now, they're sort of back at where they were before the pandemic, and this would be a good year to bring this bill forward. So those are the items I wanted to cover in my testimony, and I am happy to stand for questions that the committee may have.
Committee questions? Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Katie Gleason, Deputy Director of Environment. I guess my question just overall, how do you find these sites, and how do they get polluted, and what's going on for us to have this problem? Let's you just kind of give me an overview so I could help understand this. Thank you.
Chair, Senator Reichman, thank you for that question. The source of the contamination is typically attributed to historical housekeeping practices that happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, it could still happen. A new spill could unfortunately occur, but typically it was a lack of knowledge of what these solvents would do to the environment before, historically. So a lot of them are older releases that we're still addressing, and they're discovered usually because they're co-located with another plume, or they intersect another area that we've already got, say a storage tank site or some other type of contamination, right? They're primarily in fairly urban areas. So they are frequently in industrial areas or places where we're already sort of out there doing work, or they could be discovered because of if they're in a public water supply or a private water supply and we discover it, obviously that's the highest priority for us to address. So that's another source of discovery that we have.
Thank you, and for that answer. I guess the next question is, what is the problem? What kind of concerns can all this if it's not being treated? Thank you.
The solvents used historically in dry cleaning are carcinogens, and they're I don't know if you've heard of TCE, trichloroethylene, and PCE, those types of things. They're not good to be drinking or be exposed to for several reasons.
Senator Starnes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. So it goes into a storage tank. then what happens to it? What, it's picked up, it's quote, recycled, used again? What happens to these things after they're used? And is there some way to recycle it, or is it, what happens to it? Thank you.
Chair, that's a good question. The solvents now, are you asking about current housekeeping practices for the solvents? So they would be disposed of properly according to our hazardous waste laws. So they're in a barrel and taken to the proper facility for processing.
And so just the processing, you're not aware of what the processing is or what they do, or, yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll defer to technical expert.
Mr. Henning, if you would identify yourself for the record, please, and then you can answer the question.
All right, thank you, Chairman Peck. Senator, my name is Leo Henning. I am the Deputy Secretary and Director of Environment at KDHE. I'll probably give you more information than you want, but hopefully I can explain this to you. A dry cleaning machine, when you take your clothes in to have it dry cleaned, they put your clothes in a machine that has the solvents in it, and they actually wash your clothes in those solvents. And then they spin your clothes and they pull the solvents back out of your clothes, and they're stored all in the machine. Historically, the way the contamination occurred is that the dirt from your clothes went into a different place. They had to take it out of the machine, and that material was at that time thought was clean. It was water, and so therefore they would many times, and again, these were acceptable practices back when they were occurring. They would take that water and pour it out the back of the facility. They didn't realize that there was still a lot of perchloroethylene in that water. Also, there's filters in the machines. They would take those filters out and set them in the back and let them drip dry. So, unfortunately, common practice, they didn't realize that they were actually contaminating the soil and the groundwater from the solvents and water and dirt that they called it muck that actually came out of these machines. So that's how it occurred. And with the current law, they're no longer allowed to do any of that. It all has to be handled as a hazardous waste and be taken off to a facility that handles hazardous waste. So does that answer your question?
Yes, and continue to follow up when there's facilities, so it's just barrels stored somewhere? These hazardous waste, or?
So since they're hazardous waste generators, there are rules that tell them how long they can keep the material on their property and when it has to be shipped off. They can't have over a certain amount on their property at any time.
Mr. Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that I'm following the story correctly. So the 198 dry cleaning sites, those are historic contaminated sites, or those are all active dry cleaning sites in the state of Kansas?
Both. They're historic and
So that's a combination.
those are active sites that we're still working on, yes. That does not count the sites that we've closed to date.
So those are active contaminated sites?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't, so a new dry cleaner opens up and they're following current regulations would not be counted in that 198 number.
If they had a spill or release, they could apply for the trust fund still.
So, but yeah, be contingent on having a spill. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's all I was trying to clarify. Appreciate that.
Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Director Gleason, I'm looking on page 3 on the changes. Line 14 is where the new language starts. But if I'm reading what is being attempted here, you're removing the specific penalties from the Dry Cleaning Act, which are capped at $500, and shifting them to any of these, and I'm not sure you did it right, but anything would be a violation of the Hazardous Waste Act, which is up to a penalty of $10,000 per instance. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And what's the justification to go from 500 to 10,000?
The justification that we have internally discussed is that these spills to clean up are very expensive. So we want the penalty for mishandling these chemicals to be adequate to deter folks from doing that. We also think that it's because they're generating hazardous waste, that they should fall under the same statutory framework as other hazardous waste generators in the state. So not that the penalties would automatically be $10,000 a violation a day, but that they would be in the same penalty matrix as all of the other hazardous waste generators in the state.
You've also, the criteria that allow you to consider the seriousness that was in statute, you're also removing all of that.
Correct. So the hazardous waste program has its own set of factors for.
In statute?
That's a good question. I have to get back to you on whether or not the factors are in statute or whether they're just in we have a penalty policy and a penalty matrix that we use for our hazardous waste program.
I'm concerned we're removing protections for small business owners. I don't know if you guys have seen less dry cleaners in your communities, but if you do like to have your shirt starched, it can be trying to find one once in a while. The other question I have is on page 4, you put at the very bottom, line 43, whether or not there's a written corrective action plan. And if I'm reading this right, so this is money we're paying somebody to do in a cleanup, but the state may or may not have to have a written expectation of what that work and the cost is in advance? Or if you violate the corrective action plan, you're now subject to a $10,000 penalty instead of a $500 penalty? What's going on with removing the written requirement, and how does this fit in everything here?
I believe this is cleanup language to address the sequence of when we get the deductible, but sorry, I'm having a hard time thinking on my feet of why we made this change. So I apologize for that. Okay, so when we.
You can follow up if you want to think about it.
Okay.
That's fine, double
I
check.
appreciate that.
My overall concern, I'm fine with the fees and the revenue stuff, but this bill seems to have some pretty broad policy changes, and it's not just a fee bill, and that I just wanted to point that out as we think about this. And you didn't really talk about that in explaining or justifying that. The fee part's fine, but these other changes are pretty big policy changes if you operate a dry cleaning establishment.
Okay, yes.
My 2 cents.
Well, Chair, if I may, just speak a little bit on that. Some of the other changes that were made to clean up, I'm happy to talk about. Obviously, when you're going and looking at language that's from 1995 that was put in place before the program was operating, we found a lot of things that we were like, this is not working for the program, such as paying we had allowed under this language folks to not pay the deductible for the trust fund until action was taken. Because of the backlog of sites, folks were entering into the trust fund and then no corrective action was taken because it was a low-risk site or whatever for many years. And so we were not collecting those deductibles. So this bill shifts the payment of the deductible forward to the day that you apply, right? If you want the benefit of being in the trust fund, you should pay the deductible immediately. One other change that is on page 3 at the bottom that we struck about seeking contaminated sites. The agency got a lot of feedback from folks when there was a contaminated site in Hayesville that affected a lot of folks' private drinking water facility. And there was a lot of criticism at that time of some of our practices and why we hadn't found that site earlier. So one thing we struck was this language that says we can't go and investigate to find dry cleaning sites. Not that we're gonna put out a dragnet and go, pull samples from everywhere across the state because that's really not feasible. But this language had a chilling effect on our program's comfort in taking some more proactive measures to identify contaminated sites that may be attributable to a dry cleaning program. So I agree, Senator Titus, thanks for asking that question, that there were some additional changes that I probably should have covered in my.
Well, no, I'm glad you pointed that out. I know we had to do a budget proviso to stop you being so aggressive in enforcement of CAFOs and that were off the grid last year. So you guys have a reputation for zealously enforcing your regulations. It's important to balance that, but could you provide me the number of civil penalties and the amounts you've issued over the last 5 years?
I can. I think that it's 0, but I will pull that information for you.
Okay, thank you.
If you would provide that to the entire committee, for the entire committee to receive that answer, in addition, of course, to Senator Titus.
Of course.
And then any additional information that you learn why some significant changes are being made to answer his question, again, provide it to the committee assistant, if you would, please. That way we can have our answer, because if we are going to work this legislation, we certainly need answers before Monday.
Happy to.
Senator Titus, were you finished? Okay. Senator Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at page 8, line 25, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So it says the secretary or the director of the Division of Environment may collect any delinquent taxes, including any interest or penalty assessed pursuant to this act, upon issuance of an order requiring payment of the amount due. Is that standard? And I guess I could pose this to my fellow senators as well. Is that standard for the secretary or director of Division of Environment to collect delinquent taxes? Or is that a function of the Department of Revenue?
So we discussed this with Revenue. As I covered in my testimony briefly, the Department of Revenue originally had, or currently has, authority to collect these taxes. Again, this amount that we collect on this, to us, is significant, right, and important to our program to be able to fund corrective actions. To Revenue, it's a very low priority. They're collecting much bigger amounts from a lot more people. So what we worked with Revenue and what we had in our 2020 bill also was this language that allows us to concurrently collect taxes. So Revenue would provide us a report annually of any delinquent taxes, and then the agency would be able to, send a letter saying your taxes are overdue, or if they're resistant to that, send an order saying here are your taxes, now you really have to pay these taxes. So it is unusual, I would say, for us to be able to collect taxes. I don't think we have that authority in any other program, but because we really want to keep this funded, this is something we worked with Revenue on to include in this bill.
I guess my concern is that as this reads, it says may collect any delinquent taxes, comma. And I guess I'm concerned if the Department of Environment then all of a sudden becomes an arm of the Department of Revenue to collect any delinquent taxes from, I guess in this case, dry cleaners. It seems like a bit of an overreach of responsibility to me, because it's not, as worded, does not restrict it to just the collection of penalties or taxes associated specific with the Dry Cleaning Act. So I guess I have some concerns about crossover of function between the agencies would be one of my concerns.
Certainly. The intent there was in line 27, it says pursuant to this act, for that to apply to the taxes, the interest, and the penalty. So if there's an issue with drafting there, we can certainly clean that up. It's supposed to apply only to the taxes applicable under this act.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention, Senator Shane. Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Director, thank you for being here. And given that this potentially poisons our water supply, I can see why, the concern for it. I'm wondering, do you have a sense, though, as to why there are fewer dry cleaners now? Do you feel like it's because of fees, or is it because, I know for myself, but that's just me, I don't remember anything except one winter coat that's still in my wardrobe that needs to be dry cleaned. My first guess is that people are just pulling away from dry cleanable clothing in general. Do you have a sense of why there are fewer dry cleaners?
Yes, Senator Ware, I agree. I think that the industry is certainly shifting as folks purchase more launderable clothes that they can just wash at home. The other shift that's happening in the dry cleaning industry is sort of a consolidation, right? They have, instead of having a dry cleaning machine at every facility, now they'll have a centrally located dry cleaning machine in their city, and then they have sort of storefronts where you can drop off locations. I think those are also reducing. I've seen that, you know, in my own experience. There are fewer drop-off locations and things like that. I would argue against it being fees because I think our fees are very reasonable. $100 a year to register, you know, I don't think would trip anybody up as far as their business model. And then the environmental surcharge, the other fees are all passed on to other parties, the consumer, and the solvent fee should be paid by the distributor. So, you know, we tried to structure this to assist. We understand the dry cleaning industry is suffering because fewer folks are dry cleaning, but we have tried to structure our fees in a way that supports that.
Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question that I have, I heard 195. Is that active cases now that you have?
Yeah, I believe it's 198.
Okay. And so those are active. How long have they been active, and are we making progress to cleaning those up?
Each site will have a different history as far as how long it's been active. You can see on this chart on the second page of my testimony, the red line shows the cumulative site total. So you'll see they've been added every year. We did have a drop in 2022 when we closed several sites. So I think as this number, if it were teased out, there are sites closing as we go, but other sites are being added to the list as they're discovered. So we have sort of a general upward trajectory of number of sites. We're hoping to keep driving down as we address them through investigation or remediation.
I think that's part of my confusion. If this line that you show here is the total number of sites that have contamination, there are some that have been cleaned up, have there not?
Correct. Yeah, over the history of the program.
Do they come off of this chart, or they're included in this chart?
Correct. They come off the chart, yeah, once they're resolved or closed.
So we're finding more and more sites all the time.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And the other one you mentioned, and that was one of the questions that I had, was you mentioned drop-off sites. And you may have one dry cleaner that does it for 10 drop-off sites. Is the $100 fee for a drop-off site, or is it a $100 fee for the dry cleaning site?
I believe that it's just where the machines are.
For the machine?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Are we making progress as far as cleaning up the sites that we know about today, as far as how long? And I don't see any sites that's my concern, is I don't see any downward chart. I mean, these things are not dropping down as you clean them up on the chart. It looks like that's cumulative, is what I think I heard you say.
Correct. Yeah. We've closed since 1995. We've closed 18 sites. These they're difficult to address, to be certain, and it takes a long time to get them to closure, right? Because you're monitoring that groundwater plume for a long time potentially. So the agency is making a lot of progress, right? Because the first steps when we identify a dry cleaning site is to make sure no one's drinking the water and no one has a primary exposure pathway. So as far as what we're addressing here, it may be small steps of each site. Each site, we make sure no one is exposed. Then we can move to investigation. And so we may not be moving a lot to closure, but we are ensuring to the extent possible under our current budget that we are doing the most that we can on the highest priority sites, for example.
Are these, the location of these sites, and again, I'm questioning these a little bit because are they active dry cleaning sites then? Or are they sites that have closed and then you found the contamination?
Yeah, many are closed sites. They're no longer, some would be active dry cleaners, but some have been closed a long time. And that's part of the reason the trust fund is so valuable, because it allows that liability protection for redevelopment. Otherwise, no one would touch these properties with a 10-foot pole because the liabilities are enormous for the amount of contamination. And that's a huge benefit of the trust fund is that liability protection that allows redevelopment.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? I've been looking through the legislation, so if this has been asked and answered, I apologize. I don't think that it has. In your testimony, you indicate that you have currently 198 dry cleaning sites in the trust fund that must be addressed. The next sentence, since 1995, KDHE has addressed and resolved 18 sites. So in 30 years, you've only addressed 18 and resolved?
Yeah, yes. These sites take a very long time to address because
Very long time, approximately.
often decades, because we have to wait. So addressing the groundwater is extremely difficult. I will say we moved to first making sure no one's drinking the water or exposed to contaminated soils, then investigation, and removal of soil, right? If there's a heavy amount of contaminated soil right in the backyard of the dry cleaner or wherever, they'll remove that soil or treat the soil. Then that leaves addressing the groundwater, which these plumes can be miles long, and they can go through very heavily populated areas that we are also looking through to make sure each house does not have a drinking water well or they don't have a vapor intrusion issue. And then, as far as treating the groundwater, we can do it, but it takes a long time. And then you have to monitor that groundwater to make sure the plume is shrinking before we can actually close the site. So it does take a long time to bring these to closure, and we are working as diligently as possible with the funding that's available to do that. But it's a limited amount of funding, so we're only getting to, once we address primary exposure pathways, then the actual remediation, we don't have a lot of money left in the budget for that always, so.
So if I hear what you just said, you're indicating additional money would expedite the process,
Correct.
and you believe that the money asked for in the legislation would allow for expedited process of remedying and resolving some of these sites.
Yes.
That's your contention?
Yes.
Committee, any additional questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we experiencing any new sites? I mean, from dry cleaners that exist today, that are working today, following the regulations that we have today? Are we finding that they're violating those regulations and we are contaminating the groundwater?
We do have some new sites, yes.
And what do we do with them?
Well, that's where we would hope that the penalty authority, we could use penalties as a deterrent to discourage poor housekeeping practices, poor chemical management practices, things like that. We have a limited ability to prevent folks from spilling chemicals onto the ground, so I'm not sure if I have a satisfying answer for your question.
Yes, I've heard this a long time ago. We had a problem with dry cleaning, but I can't see these bad actors in the dry cleaning field going out and pouring the chemical on the ground like they used to. Are they doing that now, or is this an accident that's happening?
I don't think they would go back and pour it on the ground anymore. I think it would probably be an accidental release, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And how often do you see an accidental release from a dry cleaning or a business who's trying to follow all the guidelines, regulations, and be?
I think we will have to follow up with that information because that's not something we've put together.
Would it be frequently, infrequently?
Infrequently, yeah.
All right, I don't see any additional questions. I thank you for your testimony. Committee, if you see some amendments, which the chair certainly does, I don't think this is quite ready to go yet, but potentially we could get it ready to go if we decide to move forward. So I would ask committee that you get any balloons or any amendments, visit with the reviser, visit with myself, whomever you're comfortable with, to see if this, because I can see some good things in this bill, I can see some things that I have concerns with, and I think the committee has pretty much indicated the same in your questions. I have no additional conferees for, against, or neutral, so we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 184. We will, committee, now I will direct your attention to Senate Bill 89. Senate Bill 89 is a bill that we heard recently, but I will allow our reviser of statutes the great privilege of reviewing the legislation for the committee as we work, so I'll give you just a moment to pull your folder out. Again, Senate Bill 89, reviser statutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 89 would amend the State Poultry Disease Control Act. The bill would authorize the commissioner to adopt rules and regulations for the purpose of establishing certain fees. Those fees would be an annual plan participation fee of not to exceed $50, an annual certification for testing and diagnostic services related to pullorum typhoid or fowl typhoid. That fee for that certification could also not exceed $50, and then there would be a $100 per visit fee if a person requests testing or diagnostic services. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of our reviser? Give you just a moment to look over your notes to see if there's anything that you see. Committee, what is your wishes, your desire with Senate Bill 89? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to say I had an opportunity to talk with the department about my questions that I had asked during the hearing, particularly regarding the hatcheries, and I'm comfortable with their responses. I would think that we could pass this, or I would make a motion to pass this bill out favorably, and because of that we've made no changes, that we could put it on the consent calendar.
Okay, there is a motion to pass the bill favorably and place on the consent calendar by Senator Francisco. Did you say second? No. Well, you don't have to. Okay. Okay, seconded by Senator Ware. Discussion on the motion. Committee, if you feel that there are amendments needed, we will address amendments, or if you feel this bill has some controversy, the consent calendar would not be the place for it. I'm fine with it being on the consent calendar, but I'm only one vote out of the committee. Discussion on the motion, committee. Seeing none, Senator Francisco, do you wish to close on your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I close.
All right. You have heard the motion to pass Senate Bill 89 favorable and place on the consent calendar. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. No, opposed, no. Motion carries. That was much less painful than I expected, but appreciate your work, committee. I have nothing further. We will plan to meet tomorrow. The weather, of course, may play a factor, but it looks like the morning committees will be less of an issue, so hopefully you can be here. The reason I would like to meet in person, we cannot vote via WebEx, so we could take no action on any legislation, but just monitor your email. We will communicate with you if we feel we just cannot get together, but hopefully at 8:30 tomorrow morning, we can be in the Capitol, and then you're on your own after that, if you stick around or go home. But I have nothing further, committee. With that, we are adjourned.